There was a black sheep in the prestigious Rothstaler family, a student notorious for making trouble at Sylvania Academy. His name? Ed Rothstaler. Thanks to his awful behaviour, his family had finally had enough. They disowned him, cutting him off from both status and fortune. Now broke, unwanted, and with nowhere to stay, Ed was being kicked out of his dorm. The other students didn't even try to hide how eager they were to see him gone. They watched from a distance, whispering behind his back. Good riddance, they thought. School would be quieter without him. But the truth was, none of this was actually his fault, because the Ed Rothstaler they all remembered, the arrogant noble who made everyone's life miserable, wasn't really him. He had been transported into a game. Sylvania's failed swordmaster, a fantasy RPG he used to love. Normally, people summoned into another world end up with cheat skills or overpowered stats. They become the protagonist, or at least someone rich and important. But him? He woke up as a third-rate villain who barely even shows up in the story. A character who gets kicked out in the prologue. Honestly, this had to be the worst possible start. Sitting with his bags beside him, Ed clenched his fists. This was completely unfair. Why did he have to become this guy? Nearby students overheard and scoffed. They couldn't believe someone like him was complaining. He sat back down, defeated. Sylvania Academy sat on a vast island called Arcana Island. Dense forests stretched across much of the land, quiet and secluded. Ed had been walking for half a day now, heading northeast, anywhere to get away from the glares and whispers of the other students. Eventually, he sat down on his luggage in the middle of the woods. If Ed had just been disowned, that meant the game's story had only just begun. Luckily, he hadn't been expelled from the academy itself, which meant there was still a chance. If he could just survive long enough to graduate, he might be able to avoid the fate this character was destined for. Sylvania Academy was one of the most prestigious schools in the continent. Graduating guaranteed a future filled with wealth, influence, and recognition. And since the game took place at the academy, he knew the storyline inside out. That knowledge was now his biggest weapon. His first goal was simple: survive and graduate. The only problem: the tuition. This semester was already paid for, but after that, he'd need a scholarship. Sitting on a rock under the trees, he pulled up his stat screen. A glowing projection hovered in front of him. The numbers were awful. Low in every category, not that it was surprising. Ed Rothstaler barely had a role in the original game. Even he could barely remember the guy. He thought back to the ending credits after finishing the game. It had said Ed ended up as a beggar on the streets. Ed sighed. Of all the characters to end up as, why this one? For now, the tuition could wait. His most immediate problem was survival. He needed shelter, food, and something to wear. He opened the 2 luggage bags he'd been dragging through the woods. Inside? A few flashy outfits, completely impractical, no stat boosts. An ornamental dagger, looked expensive but useless in combat. And a decorative goblet, again, no stats. Well, at least he had clothing. That was one problem solved. Next step, find shelter. Then figure out food. Getting a part-time job was out of the question. His reputation was in the gutter, and there was no way he'd be allowed back in the dorms. It looked like he'd be living in the forest for a while. Luckily, there was a small stream nearby. That would help. The new semester started in 10 days. That gave him just over a week to build something that could keep him dry and warm. Standing up, Ed stretched his arms. No use complaining. He had to get started. He used a wind-based spell to begin slicing branches. It worked, but after only a few tries, he dropped to the ground completely drained. He hadn't expected magic to be this exhausting. Or maybe he was just that weak. They could have at least given him a meal before kicking him out. His stomach grumbled. Then a strange memory surfaced, something his grandfather once said. Back when food was scarce in early spring, he'd survived by eating tree bark. It was worth a try. Ed filled the goblet with stream water, dropped in a few strips of bark, and tried to heat it with a bit of fire magic. He didn't care what it tasted like. As long as it was edible, it would do. Eventually the bark softened in the hot water. He took a deep breath, told himself it was chicken, and bit into it. He forced a bite, then immediately regretted it as he doubled over, gagging. A couple of days passed. Ed was still gathering wood, but he didn't look so good. His cheeks were hollowing out and his steps were slower. Turns out, bark is not food. After 2 days of throwing up and eating nothing else, that much was clear. He'd never been more tired in his life, and the shelter wasn't exactly coming together on its own. Every task felt like too much for one person, but he kept going. Through sheer stubbornness, he finally managed to tie a basic frame together. He couldn't sleep on bare dirt, so he tossed all his extra clothes onto the ground to make a makeshift bed. The next day, the shelter was finally done. Primitive, sure, but it held together. He dropped to the forest floor and looked up at the result of his suffering, and then, to his surprise, a system notification popped up. His crafting skill had increased. He blinked. So the system really did work like the game. He opened his stats screen and checked the skill list. Handicraft. Level 4. Better than expected. Apparently, Ed Rothstaler was more suited to building things than casting spells. If he was going to survive out here, that skill might just save him. He tied the ornamental dagger to a sturdy branch, fashioning a crude harpoon. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The hunger was unbearable, and now he had a goal. Fish. He was going to eat fish. Dragging himself to the stream, Ed raised his makeshift weapon. Then, half out of desperation, half out of raw hunger, he shouted into the woods. He wanted real food! Later that day, Ed sat beside a fire he'd made using a bit of magic. His freshly caught fish sizzled over the flames. Real food. Finally. There was only a week left before the semester started. If he could keep this up, just survive a little longer, he'd be fine. He bit into the fish. It was the best thing he'd tasted in his entire life. Then an annoyed voice called out from the trees. What was he still doing here? Ed froze mid-bite and turned his head, startled. He'd been so focused on eating that he hadn't noticed anyone approaching. A girl stood at the edge of the clearing, long blonde hair swaying behind her, arms crossed, brows furrowed. She looked at him like he was some pest that had overstayed his welcome. He recognised her immediately, one of the game's main characters, and the reason he'd been kicked out of the dorm. Princess Pena. Back in the game's story, Ed Rothstaler had been a proper villain, and it wasn't hard to see why someone would want to hit him. He had tried to harass the protagonist's childhood friend. Naturally, the protagonist didn't let that slide and landed a solid punch in return. Ed, being Ed, didn't take it well. Fueled by petty revenge, he tampered with the entrance exams, trying to keep the protagonist from getting into the academy. But he got caught. Princess Pena had witnessed the entire thing. And with her unique ability, insightful eyes, she exposed his plot easily. The skill revealed lies and schemes without fail. Even when Ed swore up and down that he was innocent, the results didn't lie. And now, here they were again. The princess standing in front of him, clearly irritated, demanding to know why he was still here. This was not a good situation. The princess didn't waste time. She asked if he hadn't been expelled. Ed explained calmly that technically he was still a student. It was true that he'd been kicked out of the dorms, but not the academy. That didn't sit well with her. She said someone like him had no place at a school like Sylvania. If necessary, she'd speak to the headmaster herself. As she continued lecturing him, Ed noticed something more important. His food was about to burn. While she kept going on about how disgraceful he was, he quietly shifted tactics. If he wanted her to leave, he needed to change the subject. He walked toward her, speaking in a careful tone. The sun would be setting soon. Should a royal really be wandering alone in the woods at this hour? The princess stiffened at the implication. She asked if he was threatening her, and warned that if he was, he'd regret it. Faint magical energy began to gather around her. Ed quickly knelt on one knee, just as one should before royalty. Smiling, he told her no. In fact, he was incredibly grateful to her. That made her pause. She didn't understand what he meant, so she activated insightful eyes. A moment later, she flinched. There were no lies. He wasn't pretending. Still kneeling, Ed could tell she was surprised. But he wasn't lying. He was grateful. The Rothstaler family had always been powerful, but they were rotten. They'd abused that power, experimented on people, and chased immortality. Their crimes became a major part of the game's story, until the protagonist put an end to them. Every member of the house ended up either dead or imprisoned. But now that Ed was disowned, he could avoid that fate entirely. He might be hungry and homeless, but at least he'd live. All he had to do now was convince the princess that he wouldn't cause any more trouble. If he managed that, maybe he could avoid expulsion too. But one thing didn't make sense. Why was she here, alone in the middle of the forest? Ed stood and looked at her again. If she had no guards and was out here by herself, then there was only one explanation. She was in the middle of the entrance assignment. There was only one assignment this could be. Professor Glass' class exam. A test where students had to search the forest for hidden magical marbles. Simple in theory, but the difficulty came from how well the marbles were hidden. Ed knew the assignment well. He casually mentioned that this one was pretty tough. But of course, someone like her, a princess, would be aiming for Class A. The princess narrowed her eyes. She asked if he was trying to flatter her. It didn't seem like he'd changed at all. She kept talking, but Ed stepped forward before she could finish. Without his help, she wouldn't make it into Class A. He told her to check, use her ability again. If he was lying, she could have him expelled herself. Then he told her where to go. Southeast of the island, in the middle of a lake, there was a large tree known as the Guardian Tree of Merilda. That's where she'd find it, his gift, the golden marble. The princess stood at the base of the Guardian Tree, golden marble in hand. She stared at it in disbelief. Just 3 days ago, Ed Rothstaler had been a liar and a cheat. She could still picture that disgraceful expression. But now, the Ed she had just met felt different. The exam came to a close. Professor Glass stood before the gathered students, hands behind his back. He asked them to present what they had found. Some held out stones. Others offered beads, shiny buttons. One student even brought an egg. Turning around, the professor gave his verdict. They were all in Class F. He then raised his hands and revealed 3 glowing marbles. Golden, faintly radiating mana. These, he explained, were the real objective. Difficult to detect, they gave off just enough magical energy to be found by only the most observant. Only 3 students had succeeded. Ziggs, Lortel, and the one who had discovered the most deeply hidden marble of all, the one placed inside the Guardian Tree of Merilda. Student Penia. She had taken the top spot. Earlier, not long after the princess had left the clearing, Ed sat crouched by his fire. His fish was half burned, but he was too tired to care. He didn't have the strength to hunt again, so he started putting together a crude fishing rod instead. As he tied bait to the hook, he thought about the princess, the 3rd daughter of the Empire. Someone who had sharpened her insightful eyes through years of navigating palace politics, lies, and betrayal. He knew he couldn't have fooled her. If he'd lied, it would have been over for him right there. So instead, he gave her something useful, something that would get her off his back. But that caused its own problem. In the original story, the princess had failed that very exam. She'd been placed in Class F and humbled by the experience. That failure earned her a new reputation on campus, one that would grow stronger over time. She became known as the Princess of Benevolence, a noble who rose above her pride to treat others with fairness and dignity. But that moment, her defeat, was what changed her. Now that story was broken. Still. Ed figured it wasn't the end of the world. He might have nudged things off track, but at least the top student wouldn't change. No matter what he did, that role always belonged to Lucy Mayreal. The princess wandered the school halls, her thoughts heavier than usual. She still couldn't believe it. Ed had actually helped her find the marble. It didn't sit right. She had kept her identity hidden during the exam. She hadn't wanted to rely on her royal status to influence her grade. The goal had always been to succeed through her own effort. But now, thanks to him, she'd landed in Class A. She thought back to the moment he told her she'd fail without his help. What frustrated her most was that he'd been telling the truth. Her ability had confirmed it. The realization hit her like a weight. She stopped mid-step, clenched her fists, and drove one into the wall beside her. Ed may have helped her this time, but she'd prove him wrong. From now on, everything she achieved would be through her own work. And she'd be keeping a close eye on him. The sun rose over Sylvania Island. Ed forced himself up at dawn. The academy wasn't exactly nearby, and the run through the forest wasn't getting any shorter. Eventually he made it. Sylvania Academy loomed before him, alive with students. He stepped through the gates and paused. For a moment, he just stood there taking it in. He'd made it. Inside the main hall, the opening ceremony was already underway. Decorated tables were spread with food in every direction. A feast to welcome the start of the semester. Ed sat at his assigned spot, ignoring the whispers around him. Some students were shocked, others annoyed. They couldn't believe he had the nerve to show his face. He didn't care. The food was incredible, and if no one was going to stop him from eating, then he'd eat, and keep eating. His table was already covered in empty plates, and he was still going. He wasn't going to waste a single bite. Let them talk. His goal hadn't changed. He was here to survive, and to graduate. As he finished one last bite, a group of girls walked past behind him. One paused for just a moment. She glanced back at him, puzzled. Something about him felt different. Then she turned and walked on. The opening ceremony had officially begun. On his first day, Ed was summoned to the headmaster's office. He wasn't expelled, but the message was clear. He was being watched. One more instant, and he'd be out. From now on, he had to be careful, especially not to stray too far from the original plot. So he did what he could to stay focused. He trained in practical skills, starting with bow proficiency. It wasn't glamorous, but it would help him hunt the smaller game that roamed the forest. One afternoon, his arrow struck true, a clean hit, straight through a rabbit. As he picked up the lifeless animal, something caught his eye. Someone was sitting near the guardian tree. A girl. She sat calmly against the tree trunk, a book open in her lap. Ed recognised her immediately. Yenikar Palirova, top of the second years, a genius elementalist known across the academy. Before he could say anything, she looked up and smiled. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished, and reappeared right in front of him, as if she'd teleported straight from the lake. She introduced herself cheerfully, insisting he call her Yenikar. Ed stared. She had moved so fast it didn't make any sense. She noticed his surprise, and explained that she'd heard a lot about him. Apparently, the forest spirits had been talking. The entire forest was under the protection of a high-ranking spirit named Marilda. According to her, Ed was the new unwanted guest causing a stir. Ed broke into a nervous sweat. He hadn't realised he was an unwelcome guest, but thinking back, it made sense. He had been chopping wood and hunting around the forest without a second thought. Still smiling, Yenikar told him not to worry. Hunting was natural. Marilda didn't mind that at all. Ed, remembering that Marilda was supposed to be a spirit wolf, figured it wasn't fair to judge her by appearance, especially since the spirit didn't sound nearly as intimidating as her reputation made her out to be. Yenikar paused, then laughed. Of course, she agreed. Yenikar held out her hands with a beaming smile. She wanted to show him something. She explained that she had just formed a new contract with a spirit, and asked if he wanted to hold it. Ed paused. He knew how this was supposed to go. If he wanted to get close to her, playing along would be the easiest route. But getting close wasn't part of the plan. He lowered his gaze and calmly told her he couldn't see spirits. The cheer drained from her face instantly. Her eyes widened in surprise, and the energy around her quieted. Ed turned away, excusing himself. He still had foraging to do. As he walked, he reminded himself not to stray from the story. He couldn't afford to change anything else, not when Yennecar played such a major role later on. He needed to avoid her entirely. Behind him, Yennecar watched quietly. She thought back to what he'd said, not being able to see spirits. Then she turned to the large wolf standing beside her. She gave Marilda a light pat and told the spirit that maybe Ed really couldn't see them after all. The spirit lay down on the ground with a quiet thump. Yennecar dropped onto the thick fur with a soft grumble, burying her face in frustration. She was just trying to be nice, and he brushed her off like it didn't matter. Still lying there, she muttered that she didn't get him at all. The distance from Ed's camp to the school was far enough that he had to begin running at dawn just to make it in time. Still, he figured the daily sprint through the forest counted as a decent workout. From a shaded tree nearby, a familiar silhouette watched in silence. He studied hard in class, jotting down notes with a makeshift writing tool, a wooden poker, and a slab of stone. Paper and ink were too expensive for someone in his position. Again, someone familiar was watching. After classes, he'd stop by the river to wash his uniform and hope the heat dried it by morning. He couldn't afford a second set. Still, someone was watching. At the end of the day, he checked his supplies, water, food, firewood, making sure he had enough to last through the night. Even then, he could feel someone behind him. He finally turned around and called out, asking how long she planned to keep following him. Yennecar stepped out from behind his makeshift shelter, surprised he'd noticed. Ed told her she wasn't exactly subtle. He asked if she knew who he was. Ed Rothstaler, the one everyone despised. She brushed it off, saying what others thought didn't matter. She hadn't gotten to know him yet. Ed narrowed his eyes. This was just like her. She always looked like her head was in the clouds, but she didn't waver once she made up her mind. Still, he reminded himself of the truth. Yennecar Palarova was the final boss of Act 1. Ed closed his eyes. She was the only person who'd shown him even a little kindness since he arrived. But if he wanted to stay off the story's radar, he had to push her away. That meant playing the part everyone expected. The villain. When he opened his eyes again, he turned to her and asked for a favour. She immediately lit up, her voice full of enthusiasm. He gestured around him. Anyone could see his situation. He was broke. Being disowned had ruined him completely. So he asked her, could she lend him some money? Her expression froze. The excitement drained from her face in an instant. Ed already knew. She wasn't from a rich, noble house. She might have been the top student, but that was because she earned a scholarship. A girl from the countryside, daughter of a humble farmer, her greatest weakness was money. Yennecar stood there, visibly struggling. She didn't want to say no, but she couldn't say yes either. After a long, painful pause, she apologised. She had no money. Her voice was quiet, like something inside her had just died. Ed was on his usual hunt, making his way back to camp with dinner in hand. He still felt a little bad about how he'd treated Yennecar, but it had to be done. Keeping his distance was the only way to avoid the story spiralling further off course. He reached his shelter, ready to store his supplies, only to stop short at the sight of someone already there. Someone was sleeping in his bed. His eyes widened. Of all people, why was she here? He had been doing everything he could to avoid the main characters, yet now the most powerful student in the entire academy was napping in his shelter. Lucy May Reel. She sat up, stretched, and yawned without a care in the world. Ed just stared, still trying to process what was happening. Then she groaned, rubbing her eyes, and muttered that something was being too noisy. Still half asleep, she pointed behind him and complained that the huge wolf nearby wouldn't stop talking. It kept asking him to save Yennecar from her miserable fate.